Are you ready?
It's gonna be a hot girl disco summer. I'm never doing that again. I apologize. Why did I do that? Here, let's fix it. Something cool. What is up, YouTube? What is up, fantasy football fam? It's your boy BDE, and I'm telling you right now, your playoff push starts right freaking now. And if you're still benching guys who disappointed you last week, you're about to throw away your entire season because you got to pay attention to the matchups. And I've done over 20 hours of research, okay? In week 11, every lineup call freaking matters. Welcome back to the Game Script Gods, where we break down every matchup, every game script, and every hidden edge to help you dominate in your league, in DFS, in your betting lineups, you name it. We got you. Week 11 is where the playoff race heats up, and sitting the wrong players could be the difference between clinching a spot or missing the dance. Let's break down our smash starts and positional rankings for every major position so you can make every lineup decision the right one. We'll address the obvious players as well, because in DFS and betting purposes, these matchups are so good. You want to pay up for these guys, whether it be in your sports books or your DFS lineups. If you guys like this video, smash the freaking like, subscribe if you haven't. We are on our way to 2,500. And as always, guys, let's get freaking weird. It's time for the week 11 Game Script Gods, baby. Let's get weird. Like I alluded to earlier, guys, there's no particular order other than the positional order, where we're going to go through wide receiver and then our rankings, running back and then our rankings, tight ends, then our rankings, quarterbacks, and then our rankings. There's no particular order, and we're not going to be shamed for talking about the obvious guys, because once again, we want to bet on these guys, especially in DFS. And before we were big draft energy, we were big DFS energy, and we are still really, really big in these DFS streets. So without further ado, let's talk about number one, Ja'Marr Chase versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Why we like Ja'Marr Chase versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, other than the fact that we've missed him terribly coming off of the bye, and other than the fact that he was the wide receiver one last year. As I said, obvious guys. But Pittsburgh gives the most fantasy points on the season to the wide receiver position, 40.64. And everything we talk about is PPR format, so we're not going to address that again. The most points to the wide receiver position in the last 4 weeks, they've actually bumped that up to 49.90, almost a 9 fantasy point jump. They are the most targeted. They allow 24 targets to the wide receiver positions because there's a weakness and vacancy there. They allow the most receptions, 15.89 to the position, and the most receiving yards, 194.11. So we absolutely love him to absolutely smash. Next, we got CeeDee Lamb versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders give up the second most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 40.5, and the 10th most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, 36.17, but they haven't really played significant wide receivers. When there's elite S-tier wide receivers, which CeeDee Lamb is, they have been smashed. They allowed the third most receiving yards to the wide receiver position, allowing 170.56, despite allowing the 15th most receptions. Translation, they allow explosive. So we like CeeDee Lamb for his longest reception. We also like him for his receptions prop. They allow the third most yards per reception, 14.48 yards, and the most receiving touchdowns allowed to the position. So we also like CeeDee Lamb for an anytime touchdown. We just gave you guys a juicy parlay. Justin Jefferson against Chicago. And listen, I understand that JJ McCarthy's concerned, but we also like JJ McCarthy. He's in our sleeper video. You can click the link at the end. The Bears have been a funnel for fantasy football production to quarterbacks and wide receivers. They allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game on the season to the wide receiver position, allowing 37.12 fantasy points. The 3rd most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, 41.08. Tied for 7th most receiving yards allowed per game at 160. The most yards per reception by far and away. They allow 15.16, and the 2nd most receiving touchdowns are tied in that department with just over 1.44. Next, this guy really disappointed last week. He's not an obvious start for a lot of people, but he's an obvious start for us. We love A.J. Brown versus Detroit. Why? Because Detroit allows the 12th most fantasy points on the season 34.49 to the wide receiver position, 18th most per game in the last 4 weeks at 30.90, but they haven't really faced anybody notable at the wide receiver position in their last 4 matchups. The 5th most yards per reception, that's A.J. Brown's department, 13.60, and tied for the most receiving touchdowns allowed to the position. We like A.J. Brown for an anytime touchdown because when Detroit's in man and they play man at the 6th highest rate at 38% of their snaps, he is an absolute dominant beast. And when they're not in man, obviously, the usage is going to falter and it's not going to be there. But we also saw that he said, if you have me in fantasy, sit me. That means start me. Listen. We are not going to listen to him. We are going to start him, and we're going to start him with confidence. We like A.J. Brown a lot this week. Next, we got Nico Collins versus the Tennessee Titans. And the Tennessee Titans versus the wide receiver allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 35.09 fantasy points per game. The 4th most fantasy points in their last 4 matchups, allowing 39.90. The 10th most receptions at 12.44. The 6th most receiving yards at 163.00. And the 7th most yards per reception at 13.10. He's borderline a lock every single week for his longest reception prop. They always give us like 22, 23 and a half. He always goes for like 35. It's great. Next, Jalen Waddle versus Washington. Game is in Madrid. That's the only weird part. And also, we don't love Tua Tagovailoa. He is the definition of inconsistency. But despite that, in their last 6 matchups, and the last 5 out of their 6 matchups, other than the ugly weather game against the Cleveland Browns, Jalen Waddle has secretly gone for 5 receptions and 80-plus yards in 5 of those matchups, which is absolutely incredible. That's elite usage. That's elite consistency, no matter what the game script is. And the reason why we like him against Washington is they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, 38.8. They've only gotten worse in the last 4 matchups, allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game in the last 4 matchups, 47.18, which is freaking insane. The 10th most receptions per game, 12.50. The 2nd most receiving yards per game at 177.90. The 4th most yards per reception at 14.23. And they're tied 3rd for the most receiving touchdowns allowed to the position at 1.30. We also like Malik Washington as a fantastic sleeper play this week as well, because they give up the most fantasy production to the slot position, and Malik Washington runs the vast majority of his routes from there as well. Last but not least, at the wide receiver position, we like Khalil Shakir versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Tampa Bay allows the 13th most fantasy points per game on the season to wide receivers, 33.86. The 7th most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, 37.60. They are also the 6th most targeted room because there's a vacancy there. Teams don't like to run inside, so they like to target the wide receivers at 21.00. The 5th most receptions per game at 12.78. The tied for the 7th most receiving yards per game, 160, and they also give over 14 fantasy points PPR format, like I alluded to earlier. This is the only format we talk about, to the slot receiver, with Dalton Kincaid potentially out with a knee injury, and we have no clarity on that yet, but it's looking like he's going to be out. We're going to see Khalil Shakir get hyper-focused, hyper-targeted. He's going to be one of the best non-talked about wide receivers for you in your fantasy football lineups this week. We absolutely love Khalil Shakir in his matchup, especially in the slot, especially in one of the highest implied point total games on the week, if not the highest. All right, so let's talk about and we did a little slide for you here. Let's talk about our top 20 wide receiver rankings. We got CeeDee Lamb at 1, 2, Jamar Chase, 3, Puka Nacua, 4, Jackson Smith and Jigba, 5, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 6, Drake London, 7, Rashee Rice, 8, Justin Jefferson, 9, Emeka Egbuka, 10, Nico Collins, and feel free to take a screenshot. 11, Jalen Waddle, like we talked about. 12, Ladd McConkey. We love him in this matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'd like to have him a little bit higher, but I mean, there's just too many good wide receivers this week. 13, Devontae Adams. 14, Roman Dunze. 15, A.J. Brown. 16, Devonta Smith. 17, Jamison Williams, because he's a man defense killer. His ADOT, average depth of target, against man defense is 25 yards per target, which is unheard of. It is borderline like historic. It's so good, right? And when you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, they run man defense at a 50% clip, which is the 2nd highest in the NFL. Next, we got T. Higgins at number 18. 19, we got my guy Khalil Shakir. And number 20, we got DK Metcalf. I would also like to bump DK Metcalf up in the Cincinnati Bengals matchup, but his usage has been incredibly inconsistent, and I feel like it's going to be all tight ends all day. All right, next, we're going to talk about running backs, okay? So Jaylen Warren versus Cincinnati. Cincinnati is the most advantageous matchup for running backs on a weekly basis. Always start your running backs against Cincinnati and your tight ends, but I mean, Arthur Smith has like 4 tight ends that he's going to use, and they probably will all find the end zone this week. It might be a parlay that I have there, a long shot. Don't go in on that one too high. Anyway, Cincinnati versus running back. The most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 33.46 fantasy points per game. The second most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, allowing 36.15. They allow the second most rush attempts, allowing 25.78. The most rush yards allowed per game at 141. The second most yards per rush at 5.47. The second most rush TDs allowed per game at 1. They're tied in that department. Tied for also the third most receptions, which is well within, like all of this is well within Jalen Warren's wheelhouse. They allow 5.11 receptions to the running back position on a weekly basis. The fourth most receiving yards at 44.33, and the seventh most yards per reception at 8.67. Across the board, it's all green. It's all green light. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if Jalen Warren finishes as the RB1. It's just Arthur Smith is probably going to do some Kenneth Gainwell shit, or finally make Caleb Johnson relevant, or who knows, he might just bring Cordell Patterson into the mix and just really kill us all, or he might just give all. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking about Arthur Smith. No, I'm not. He might just give all the handoffs and all the running back work to Jonnu Smith just to really fuck us up. Fuck Arthur Smith. All right, next, Devon Achane versus Washington Commanders in Madrid. Washington versus the running backs on the season, they've given up the 10th most fantasy points per game, allowing 23.99. Over the last 4 matchups, it's gotten significantly worse. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game, allowing 27.90. The 6th most rush attempts per game, so there's going to be a lot of volume, a lot of work, and he is one of the most explosive players on a per-touch basis, whether it be in receptions or running. They allow 24 rush attempts per game, the 8th most rush yards per game at 107.90. The 9th most receiving yards at 36.40, and the 3rd most yards per reception. So we also like Devon Achane over 13.5 longest reception. So yeah, he's going to smash. Next, Rico Dowdle versus Atlanta. Atlanta versus running back on the season has allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game, allowing 26.53. They also let Jonathan Taylor break fantasy football last week with almost 50 fantasy points. The most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, 39.73. The 5th most rush attempts allowed at 24.56, and the 4th most rush yards allowed per game at 116.89. No matter how you cut it, Dowdle's floor is like 15, 17 fantasy points. His ceiling could break fantasy football. He could also be in line for RB1 because that offensive line, they travel well and it's built really, really well. And coming from a former offensive lineman, I just appreciate good offensive line play. Next, we got Josh Jacobs versus the New York Giants. The New York Giants versus running backs has been free fantasy points. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points on the season, allowing 26.79. It's been incredibly consistent, especially over the last 4 matchups, because they've also given up the 3rd most fantasy points within that time frame at 33.88. They allow the 2nd most rushing yards per game at 119.70, and the 3rd most rushing touchdowns allowed to the position per game at just under 1, so 0.90. So you're almost talking about an anytime touchdown guarantee there. Next, we got James Cook versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he's coming off of a stinker in one of the plussest matchups in football. But yeah, we'll talk about it. So Tampa Bay versus running back position, 9th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 24.02 fantasy points per game. 5th most points per game in the last 4 weeks, 27.30. So they've gotten worse. They allowed the most receiving yards per game, 52.11 to the running back position, and by far and away the most yards per reception at 10.91. Should we see him get involved in the receiving game? He could be the RB1 this week, but Joe Brady and that offense has been incredibly inconsistent. We're also going to say that like Ja'Cory Crosby-Merritt has to start this week. You have to start, and this is an honorable mention coming off the top. It's one of the pluses matchups just because we didn't see it come into fruition this past week against the Miami Dolphins. Yeah, like we didn't see James Cook just major brain fart super early. We didn't see James Cook take advantage of the incredible matchup against the Miami rush defense. Ja'Cory Crosby-Merritt should and could. We really do like Ja'Cory Crosby-Merritt. He cannot sit. He's a fantastic flex option. Okay, last but not least, at the running back position, we got Javonte Williams against Las Vegas on Monday Night Football. They've given up on the season the 15th most fantasy points per game to the running backs, 22.12. The 11th most fantasy points per game in the last 4 matchups, 23.67. The 11th most rush attempts allowed per game at 21.78. And the 2nd most rushing touchdowns allowed as well at 1. So we love Javonte Williams for any time touchdown. And we also think he's been absolutely elite in the receptions upside, but nobody's talking about it. And it's a plus matchup because the Vegas Raiders give up 4.67, almost 5 receptions per game to the running back position, and we never see Javonte Williams leave the field. So we absolutely love Javonte Williams in this matchup. So when we're looking at our running backs here are our running back top 20. We got Bijan Robinson in a bounce back situation this week at our RB1, CMC at RB2, Devon Achane RB3, Jahmyr Gibbs RB4, Rico Dowdle RB5, Josh Jacobs RB6, James Cook RB7, Travion Henderson plays tonight against the New York Jets. He's RB8. There's no Ramondre, no problem. Number 9, Saquon Barkley. He could break fantasy on any given Sunday, but the Detroit Lions have allowed literally the least fantasy points per game to the running back position. It's going to be all in the air, and it's going to be a shootout. Hopefully he gets involved in the passing upside. Just based off of his explosive upside, he'll always be a top 10 running back as long as he's healthy. Number 10, Jaylen Warren. He should be bumped up. Number 11, Javonte Williams. Number 12, Chase Brown against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Number 13, we like Kyron Williams. 14, Ashton Genty. 15, Derrick Henry. 16, Quinshon Judkins. 17, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. Honorable mention. 18, Breece Hall. 19, Rachaad White. Number 20, we like Travis Etienne. All right, let's talk about tight ends. And let's talk about Oronde Gadsden first and foremost versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, because the Jaguars have been free fantasy points for your tight ends. They've allowed the second most fantasy points per game on the season to the tight end position, 18.66. The second most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks at 31.07. Holy shit. Dalton Schultz looked like fucking Brock Bowers last week, okay? The second most targeted team, 9.44 targets per game. The second most receptions at 6.89. The fourth most receiving yards, 72.56. And the second most receiving touchdowns at 0.78. We love him in this matchup. And if you guys are concerned about the injury, he practiced in full on Wednesday, and he's probably going to practice full as well today. So the knee injury isn't as bad as we had initially thought. So do not play Tyler Conklin this week. Next, Harold Fannin versus Baltimore. And hear me out, right? Because my logic is not tight end related, it's slot related, but we'll get into it. Baltimore allows the third most fantasy points per game on a per game basis to slot receivers. Why did I say per game twice? Allowing an average of 15.5 fantasy points per game. I just said per game as well. Which is how we were able to identify Jalen Naylor last week as our sleeper call, who ended up finishing as the wide receiver 4 in fantasy football. So we're going to go back to the well. And even though Harold Fannin is considered a tight end, he still leads the Browns with 45.45% of his snaps from the slot. That's 152. Next closest is Isaiah Bond with 118. And he could be a sneaky sleeper play as well, but I want to trust consistency in advantageous matchups, and Fannin has been consistent this year. Other than the tight end advantage, Baltimore versus the wide receiver has given up the 9th most fantasy points per game, allowing on the season, allowing 38.10, the 9th most fantasy points. And like Baltimore's defense has improved. The one area where they've been consistently bad since they're coming off of the bye has been against the wide receiver and slot position. In their last 4 matchups, they've allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game, allowing 36.830. So it's been consistently bad. They're the second most targeted team, 22.44, second most receptions per game at 13.89, and fourth most receiving yards per game at 166.11. Next, we got Zach Ertz versus Miami. Miami versus the tight end gives up the third most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 17.51. The fifth most fantasy points per game in their last 4 matchups, allowing 20.45. Tied for fifth most receptions per game at 6.30, fifth most receiving yards per game at 71.40, seventh most receiving yards per reception, seventh most yards per reception, 11.33, and tied for third most receiving touchdowns allowed at 0.70. Next, we got Kyle Pitts versus Carolina. Carolina has given up the 7th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 15.84. The 17th most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks at 13.25. So his floor is roughly 14 fantasy points this week. 10th most receptions per game, 5.60. The 6th most receiving yards per game, 7.40. But the reason why we really like him, especially his longest receptions prop, is because Carolina gives up explosives, and that is literally all he does. They give up the second most yards per reception at 12.57. Last but not least, it's Travis Kelce versus Denver. And listen, I hear you loud and clear. Denver's been really, really good against the tight end for the season. They've given up the 25th most, so 7th least amount of fantasy points on the season, 11.21. But in the last 4 matchups, they've bumped that up to 15.9, which is the 12th most advantageous matchup on the week for tight ends. And they also give up the most yards per reception per game. And Travis Kelce is the best friend of Patrick Mahomes, and he's going to continue to get targeted in volume. We love his longest reception prop this week at just 14.5. It's borderline criminal. All right, so our top 14 tight ends on the week. Trey McBride, number 1. 2, Brock Bowers. 3, Ronnie Gatson. 4, George Kittle. 5, Dallas Goedert. 6, Hunter Henry. 7, Jake Ferguson. 8, Travis Kelce. 9, Harold Fannin Jr. 10, Mark Andrews. 11, Kyle Pitts. 12, Sam Laporta, because I'm a Laporta supporter. Would like him a little bit higher, but no tight ends eat against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Sunday Night Football game is going to be great, though. He might just get schemed into an explosive play. 13, Zach Ertz. 14, we like Kate Otten against the Buffalo Bills. You just want to invest in the high implied point total game, and that's one of the best games that you can bet on this week. All right, 3 quarterbacks. 1, we like Justin Herbert versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I'm going to go out and say this. He's my quarterback 1 on the week. The Jags against the quarterback position have given up the 5th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 20.97 fantasy points per game. The 2nd most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, allowing 27.01. They also allowed a guy like Davis freaking Mills, to finish as a QB1 last week with 29 plus fantasy points. They allowed the 3rd most pass attempts per game, allowing 37.89. So there's not a lot of rushing room because that run defense is really good. That's why Kamani Vidal isn't a top 20 running back for us this week, and he's borderline sittable. They allow the 5th most pass completions as well to the quarterback position, 23.89. So we like his pass completion prop, which is at 21.5. The 5th most pass yards per game, 261.67, and the 2nd most passing touchdowns allowed per game, 2.3. There's also rushing upside and rushing touchdown upside every single week with Justin Herbert, because as of now, he's leading all quarterbacks with rushing yards and rushing yards per game. Just been a monster of a man, even though he has like one of the lowest graded offensive lines in football, simply because both of his offensive tackles are out. Nevertheless, going on to the next guy, we got Drake May tonight against the New York Jets. And like, I want to say I learned my lesson last week starting Bo Nix and saying Bo Nix is a top 10 quarterback and in a smash position on Thursday Night Football, but I did. We're going back to the well because this matchup is just too good against the New York Jets. The New York Jets versus the quarterback position give up the 9th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 18.96 fantasy points per game. They allowed the 11th most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, allowing last 4 matchups, 19.04. The 7th most passing touchdowns allowed per game at 1.89. We're going to take him for 3 passing touchdowns tonight. The 6th most rushing yards allowed, which is well within the wheelhouse for Mr. Drake May to quarterbacks. They allow 25.89. Last but not least, we got Jordan Love versus the New York Giants. The Giants have been a funnel for quarterback production. They're going to continue to be, especially this week, in a bounce back situation for Jordan Love. The Giants allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game on the season, allowing 21.06. The 3rd most fantasy points per game in the last 4 weeks, allowing 26.48. The 8th most pass attempts per game, 35.40. The 9th most pass completions, 22.80. The 10th most passing yards, 244.20. And the 2nd most rush yards allowed per game at 27.90. So I think a sneaky prop would be Jordan Love's rushing yards prop. And now our top 14 quarterbacks: Justin Herbert, number 1, Josh Allen, number 2, Drake May, number 3, Lamar Jackson, number 4, Patrick Mahomes, number 5, number 6, Jalen Hurts, number 7, Dak Prescott, number 8, Matthew Stafford, number 9, Baker Mayfield, number 10, Aaron Rodgers, number 11, Caleb Williams, 12, Jared Goff, 13, Joe Flacco, 14, our guy Jordan Love, just because the game script could be ugly and the game could be out of hand early and often. But if Jameis Winston does Jameis Winston things, you're either going to get 30 fantasy points, which is great for the game script, means we're going to get a shootout and more pass attempts, or you're going to get 3 fantasy points, which means Jordan Love is probably going to be not a top 14, not even a top 20 quarterback. Again, as always, guys, if you guys like the video, smash the freaking like. Subscribe if you haven't. Would really mean the world to me. The best way you guys could support this channel is by subscribing, liking, and turning that bell notification on. As always, shout out to our sponsors, Drafters Fantasy Sports. Use promo code DISCO to double your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100, and tail us on our pick'em tickets tonight at 7 p.m., where I'm joined by my co-host with the most, Mr. Sleez. If you guys haven't subscribed to him, please do so. He puts out great fantasy football content. So good that he and I have partnered up and created the TheGuyzFF Patreon and Premium Discord, where for a very convenient price of $5 a month, you guys could get 100% direct access to us and our fantasy football advice. Whenever you guys ask, we'll answer right then and there immediately. We always prioritize you guys. We always give you guys our betting locks as well, DFS advice, you name it. You got it all in that incredible Discord for very convenient. Like if you're buying is $100. What's $5 a month for you to go secure the $1,200, $1,400 that you'd be winning in your fantasy football championships? We're going to get you that. We'll get you that. Shout out to our sponsors, Better Vision. No better place to consolidate all of your fantasy football stuff, your betting stuff, your DFS stuff, your best ball stuff. What? In one freaking, Steve Austin, in one freaking app. It's free across the board. No better place to sweat all of your fantasy football, NFL, Sunday stuff in one app. No need to have 69 apps open. Shout out to our sponsors, Bull Rush, because they're absolutely incredible. It's the perfect marriage of fantasy football and betting. If you guys like the video, once again, smash the freaking like. If you guys think, okay, well, like you gave us way too many obvious guys here. Like none of these guys are available in the waiver wire. None of these guys are sleepers. I need sleepers. I got a lot of injuries. Well, check out our sleeper video here. Check us out live tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time, which is Thursday, for our live Q&A, start, sit, and trade advice. Check us out on Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, where I'll be joined by Sleez, Hames, and Chev. And we'll be answering all of your start sit questions and your trade advice questions there. Once again, guys, if you guys want to see our top 12 sleepers, where we call guys like Mac Hollins, where we called guys like Jalen Naylor, Davis freaking Mills, where we called those guys last week, check out our Week 11 sleepers video right here. Time for the best outro in fantasy football, guys. Appreciate you guys. Thank you for rocking with me. Peace.